You'll find the word Christian 3 times in the Bible. The first time is where you find the definition of the word. The other 2 times are not helpful necessarily in defining the word, since the second time is when King Agrippa says, Paul, almost you persuade me to be Christian, and the other time is in 1 Peter where he says, if anyone suffers for being a Christian, let him not be ashamed. But neither of those passages tell us much about what the word Christian means. The other passage, the first in the Bible to mention Christian, is Acts 11:26, where it says the disciples were first called Christians in Antioch. So obviously the word Christian was a new term that was coined for an old group of people who were called the disciples. They were called disciples elsewhere. In Antioch, someone started calling them Christians, and the name stuck. And so we call them Christians. We call ourselves Christians now. And much less frequently do we use the term disciple. I'm not sure why that is, but I think I have a theory, and that is that if you read the Gospels, many people don't want to be what would be called a disciple, because the qualifications for being a disciple are considerably, more demanding, we might say. If you read the teachings of Jesus on the subject, then we consider the requirements for being a Christian to be. Because we don't consider Christian and disciple to be the same thing in many cases. We think of being a Christian as where you've said the sinner's prayer and been baptized, and you're now in the church, and you now can sign on to a certain set of doctrines about God and about Jesus. And if you hold to the orthodox position and you've been baptized into the church, well then, of course, what else are you but a Christian? There's no better name. You're not a Muslim or a Buddhist. We think of being a Christian as being an adherent to the Christian religion. And so there's many, many people in America, especially, who call themselves Christians. In fact, worldwide, about a quarter of the world's population identifies themselves as Christian of one kind or another. Now, wouldn't it be a wonderful world if a quarter of the population of the world were really Christians? What a different world it would be. It's obvious that even America would be a very different place, a different society, if we really had, 70+% of the people who say they are Christians really are what the Bible calls Christians. But the word Christian, of course, has become a very watered down term. When you use the word disciple, you're really using a synonym for the word Christian. And a person who's not a disciple is not what the Bible calls a Christian. So it's important for us to know what it means to be a disciple. Now, the word discipleship, like the word Christianity, is not really found in the Bible. The word disciple is, and the word Christian is. But we use the word discipleship a lot in the modern church, and a lot of times when we do, we're thinking of a paradigm for training Christians. When we talk about discipling, often we're thinking of maybe a small group under a mature Christian, and he is training them in the way of being a Christian, the way of living as a Christian, and so forth, which is a good thing to do. But a lot of times when we hear the word disciple or discipleship, we're thinking of some kind of a relational thing between an older Christian, a mentor of some type, who's training a younger Christian how to do the thing, how to jump through the ropes and live like a Christian. In fact, back in the 70s, there was a movement called the discipleship movement, which was also called the shepherding movement. And the assumption was, if you were not in a shepherding group where you had somebody training you, overseeing your life, like Jesus did with his disciples, you weren't really a disciple. You weren't really where you're supposed to be as a Christian, because discipleship was considered primarily to be a training paradigm. But when we talk about discipleship in the biblical sense of being a disciple, it means following Jesus himself. We are Jesus' disciples. Now, in Jesus' day, there were people who were disciples of other teachers. John the Baptist, for example, had disciples. And some of the disciples of Jesus actually were originally disciples of John the Baptist and began to follow Jesus instead. The Pharisees had disciples. The significant rabbis, had their disciples. In Jesus' day, a generation before Jesus, the 2 most significant rabbis were men named Hillel and Shammai, and each of them had their disciples. The Pharisees were disciples either of Shammai or Hillel. and they were disciples. Outside of Israel, Socrates had disciples, Plato had disciples. A disciple was somebody who was attached to a teacher of some kind for special training. And that's why we use the word sometimes when a small group of men, or maybe a one-on-one type situation, a younger Christian man is being trained by an older Christian man. He's sort of like, it's a discipleship situation. But the thing is, of course, that person, the younger person, is not really a disciple of that older person. The idea is to be a disciple of Jesus. And while the shepherding discipleship movement back in the 70s was tapping into something that was perhaps a necessary focus, and that was that many young Christians were not being very well discipled. They weren't being very well trained. And somebody needed to look to that and set up some kind of a way to make sure they got some proper training. It tended to shift the whole definition of discipleship to, like I said, this kind of training paradigm within small groups or whatever. Whereas when Jesus called people to follow him, they were called to be followers of him directly. Now we might think, well, that's not exactly possible now because he's not here now. I mean, when Jesus said to Matthew, follow me, and he left his tax booth to follow Jesus, obviously follow Jesus had some very specific and obvious meaning. Jesus was walking that direction. He said, follow me. You start walking that direction behind him. That's how you follow somebody. However, today, Jesus isn't walking visibly from one place to another. He's frankly everywhere at once, so you don't have to go anywhere to stay near him. But following him still has a meaning, and discipleship still means following Jesus. But it has a different, perhaps, way to be understood or applied in a situation where Jesus is not visibly present with us. Let me first of all describe biblically what a disciple is. What is the definition of a disciple? Jesus gives that definition in John chapter 8. And there in verse 31, he said, to those Jews who believed in him, that's who he was addressing, we're told. In John 8:31, the previous verse tells us there were many who believed in him. And so Jesus turned and spoke to the crowd that believed in him. It says, then Jesus said to those Jews who believed in him, if you abide, the word means remain or continue, in my word, you are my disciples indeed, and you shall know the truth, and the truth will make you free. Now, you are my disciples indeed. The inclusion of the word indeed, of course, is for emphasis and in contrast to the word not for real. There are people who are disciples, but not for real. They're not the real deal. They're not genuine. You are my disciples indeed means you really are my disciples as opposed to really not. And he said the way that a person can be seen to be a genuine disciple, and since we know that the word disciple and Christian really are just synonyms, is that you really continue in what Jesus said. You continue in his words. I mentioned last night that I grew up in a church that didn't maybe talk about these things so much, and I didn't understand them until I was older and read the Bible much more on my own. And I remember when I first began to read the Gospels as a young adult, I saw Jesus making lots of statements about disciples, which made it sound like they were really committed people. And I remember thinking of the people who went to church with me. I'm thinking, well, some of them might qualify under these terms that Jesus talks about, but I'm not really sure who does and who doesn't. I knew I wanted to be a disciple, but I wasn't sure how many role models I had in the church of people who were really fitting the description. Now we're going to look at that description this morning so you know what I'm talking about. But I think I concluded tentatively when I was younger that there's two kinds of Christians. There's the ordinary Christian who's a believer, and because he's a believer, he's going to go to heaven when he dies. And then there's that other kind of Christian who's a disciple. You know, and they were like the really committed Christians. They were the ones who end up going out and witnessing on the streets, or they become missionaries, or they just live a very radically different kind of life from the mainstream Christian. But that was sort of like in the military, you've got the special forces. You know, you've got the regular army, and then you've got the Green Berets or the Navy SEALs or something like that. The disciples in the church would be like the special forces of God's kingdom. And again, it took me a while to figure out that that was not the correct way of thinking. Turned out that those people I was calling the special forces were the Christians. And the people that were not disciples, well, I'm not the judge. I really can't say who is and who isn't a disciple, at least not in every case. I mean, if someone tells me they're not, then I know they're not. If someone says they are, I'm not sure whether they are or not. I'm not their judge. But I do think that everyone needs to, as Paul said, examine himself and see if he's in the faith. Because some people apparently, if they did examine themselves, they'd discover something along those lines. That they're not in the faith. They are in the movement. They're in the church. They're in American evangelicalism. But they may not be in what the Bible calls the faith of being a disciple of Jesus. And so I want to talk about what that looks like. Jesus said, if you continue in my words, or abide in my words, you are my disciples indeed. Now, to abide in his words, what does that mean? A lot of people think that Jesus' words and the words of Jesus and the New Testament that we're supposed to be following have to do primarily with the theological content. You know, for years I thought being a Christian would depend a lot on whether you are a Trinitarian or not. I believe in the Trinity. All Orthodox Christians do believe in the Trinity. I met people sometimes who seemed to be Christians in other respects, but had their questions about the Trinity. They weren't so sure, or they had a different understanding. I used to think, well, they're not quite a Christian until they understand the Trinity properly, or some other doctrinal thing like that. To me, I felt like being a real Christian required that you have real Christian theology. And by theology, I meant conceptual understanding of God and justification by faith and the substitutionary atonement and those important things, which I understand and believe. I felt like that's what constitutes a Christian. Therefore, if I met someone who didn't believe in the Trinity, they must be a cult or something else, because they certainly weren't a Christian. They didn't have good theology. But as I read the Gospels and saw how Jesus walked about and spoke with his disciples, I realized that he never ever gave them a Bible study on record about theological subjects like that. We don't see Jesus having a seminary class where he taught them about the Trinity and justification by faith and substitutionary atonement. Now, he did make allusions to those things, and we get much of our understanding of those things from allusions he made, coupled with things the disciples themselves later said when they wrote the epistles. But his actual training of them did not focus on those things as near as we can tell from what's recorded. What it focused on was how to be humble before God, genuine before God, not to be a hypocrite, like the hypocrites when you pray and when you fast and when you give alms. How to be pure in heart, how to be poor in spirit, how to be a peacemaker, how to love people, even your enemies, how to forgive. In other words, Jesus was teaching them to be a different kind of person, not to have a different set of opinions about theological concepts. Now, Jesus did eventually have his disciples learn some very new concepts that they didn't learn in Judaism. Because, for example, the Trinity doctrine, which I'm quite sure they came to believe, they didn't hold that in Judaism. Judaism doesn't teach Trinity. And what's interesting is when Jesus called them as Jewish fishermen and Jewish tax collectors and such, he didn't sit down right away and say, now listen, you guys have had some inadequate training here about God because it's really this Trinity idea here. Now, they eventually understood that, but you know, on the very last day he was speaking with them before his crucifixion, one of them said to him, Philip said to him, Lord, show us the Father, and it's sufficient for us. And he said, Philip, have I been so long time with you, and you still don't know who I am? Apparently he didn't. Here he's one of the 12 disciples, been discipled for 2.5 years perhaps with Jesus, and he still didn't know what Jesus hoped they would know. He apparently hadn't laid it out quite plainly in a way that they would understand, or maybe they were just dull of hearing. But the point is, what he had taught them plainly is about how to love one another, how to forgive, how to be just, how to be faithful, how to be humble. In other words, he taught them how to be God-like. Not so much how to have all the right opinions about God, as to be like God. I remember it was the Catholic monk, Thomas Aquinas, who wrote The Imitation of Christ. He said, what did he say? He said, I'd rather be humble, didn't know the definition of humility or something like that. It might have been talking about some other trait. I'd rather be pleasing to the Trinity than know how to explain the Trinity. That's kind of what he was saying. And I thought it was rather interesting, because that is apparently the focus of Jesus' ministry, is teaching people how to live in a way pleasing to God, how to be different inside and out. And the theology matters seem to be saved for a later lesson, like after Jesus was gone. Remember in the upper room in John 16, verses 12 and 13, Jesus said, to his disciples, said, I have still many things to say to you, but you're not able to endure them yet. So I'm going to leave that unsaid. Later, the Holy Spirit will come and he'll lead you into all truth. And that's where I think their theology lessons came later on. But the first lessons, the ones that Jesus focused on, are those that you find, for example, in the Sermon on the Mount, of which there's very little of what we could call theology proper, although he's certainly taught them what God is like. He's like a father. If you earthly fathers know how to give good gifts to your children, even though you're evil, how much more will your Heavenly Father give good gifts to those who ask him? It's clear that what Jesus is trying to do is put them into a relationship with the Father that did not primarily have to do with them having all the right theological concepts. That could come later. Because, you know, when the disciples left their nets to follow Jesus, we know they weren't Trinitarians then. And from Philip's question at the end of his life, end of Jesus' life, it looks like they weren't Trinitarians then either. Jesus didn't work on that part first. What he worked on first was who they are and what they are and how they live. Now, of course, all of that has to be based on some basic theological understanding. But the things they had to understand about God were not so much the philosophical things. Remember it says in Jeremiah 9:23, let not the wise man glory in his wisdom. Let not the mighty man glory in his might. Let not the rich man glory in his riches. But he that glories, let him glory in this, that he understands and knows me, that I am the Lord, that I exercise loving kindness and justice in the earth. For in these things I delight. Let people glory in that they know God. What things about God? The hypostatic union of the two natures of Christ? Well, that was never discussed in the Bible anywhere. That they might know that I am a God who loves justice and who loves mercy and who is compassionate. And I delight in these things. There's the character of God. Why does he want us to know what the character of God? Because we're going to become like the God we worship. And if we might have all the right doctrines of the more abstract theological concepts and not know God at all. Like Jesus could be saying to us, have I been so long time with you and you don't know me? And being a disciple means that you do know him. You come to know Jesus and you come into a relationship with him where you are under his tutelage, you're under his training, and he trains you. Now, when we make disciples, that's a process also that's mentioned in Matthew 28, in the Great Commission at the end of Matthew 28, verses 18 through 21, or 18 through 20. Jesus said, go, well, he said, all authority on heaven and earth has been given to me, so I'm the king of everything. That's what authority means. I'm in charge. I'm the ruler. I've been assigned to be the ruler and Lord of everything. All authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Therefore, you better go out and bring the world into compliance. So go out and make disciples out of the nations, because I'm their king and they don't know it. So you go out and you baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and you what? Teach them what? To obey, to observe everything I've commanded you. That's the curriculum. The curriculum is to, Jesus said, make disciples. How do you do that? You baptize them. Of course, there's some things come before the baptizing.
Right.
You got to preach to them. They got to repent and believe. But once they come to that point, you baptize them. Now, they're beginning. Sometimes we think that once we get a person baptized in the church, we got that one, let's go out and get some more. And if you're an evangelist, that is what you're supposed to do. The evangelist is supposed to go out and bring in more fish, but someone's got to clean the fish. You've got to have somebody who teaches them to observe everything that Jesus commanded.
Right.
And that's what making disciples means. Because why? Because continuing what Jesus said, in other words, doing what he commanded, is discipleship. And so a disciple is someone who is come into a relationship with Christ like a Jewish person might have come into a relationship with a rabbi in Jesus' day. and attached to him and under his discipline, under his training, and conforming to what he says to do. Now, Jesus said in John 13, at verse 34 and 35, he said, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you. Then what did he say? By this, all men will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. Now, he said, the command is a new command. Now, there was really an old command that had been around a long time that sounded a lot like that one. It was in Leviticus. It said, love your neighbor as you love yourself. That was not a new commandment by any means. To love your neighbor as you love yourself was basic to the law of Moses. Jesus in his ministry once said that the whole law and the prophets are summarized by this command, this one and the one to love God. But now Jesus, at the end of his life on earth, says, I'm giving you a new commandment, that you love one another, but not as you love yourself, but as I have loved you. You see, if you love someone as you love yourself, it means you love them on the same level as yourself. John the Baptist is a great example of teaching how to do that. The people came to John the Baptist in Luke 3 and said, what should we do? He said, if you got 2 coats, give one of them to a person who has none. That's loving your neighbor as you love yourself. You love yourself enough to keep one, and you love your neighbor enough to give him one. You want him to have what you have. Not necessarily more nor less. He and you are on the same level of priority as far as you're concerned if you love your neighbor as you love yourself. That's the old law. Some of us would do real well to just get up to speed with the old commandment. But Jesus said, I got a new assignment for you. It goes a step further. Love one another as I have loved you. Well, how did he love you? Well, he existed in the form of God, and he thought it not robbery to be equal with God, and he emptied himself and took on the form of a servant. And having been found in the form of a man, he humbled himself to the point of the cross. Why? For himself? No, really it was for his Father's sake, but we benefit from it. And he has loved us by the sacrifice of himself. In the upper room he said, greater love has no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. So if you lay down your life for someone else, you're not putting them at your level, you're putting them above yourself. That business of having 2 coats and giving one to someone who doesn't have any becomes, if you have 1 coat, you give it to someone who doesn't have any. Richard Wurmbrand, who was a Romanian pastor who spent 14 years in a communist prison in Romania, 3 of those years in solitary confinement, some of them in the tuberculosis ward, where he was the only person who ever came out alive from that ward, but many people came in. He said none of them left except to go to heaven, because he won them all to Christ when they were in there in prison in the tuberculosis ward. But he's the only one who came out of the ward without dying. But he used to, he ended up in the tuberculosis ward where he was in prison. One of the former guards who had tortured him in the past ended up in the tuberculosis ward. One thing, if you read Richard Wurmbrand's history of the Romanian communist movement, you find that the people who are the leaders of the movement end up in prison within a few years, and someone else is the new leader, and then they end up in prison when the new leaders come up. There's no loyalty among the leadership. It's just a dog-eat-dog system, and the person who is in the leadership position is in prison and executed shortly afterwards by the next leaders. And there was a guy who had been a guard who had beaten him on his feet as part of his torture, and this man ended up in prison himself, and then with tuberculosis, and Richard Wurmbrand, the pastor, washed this man's feet while he was in prison. And the man would die there, and the man, before he died, he said, Pastor Wurmbrand, you've talked a lot about Jesus. I still can't quite grasp. What is this Jesus like that you've talked so much about? He said, well, he's a lot like me. And when I hear that, my first impression is, that's blasphemy. To say Jesus is a lot like me. And if I say that's blasphemy, that's because I'm not a very good Christian. Because as a Christian, that's exactly what should be able to be said. When we meet people and we tell them about Christ, they say, don't talk about Christ. I know about all those hypocrites in the church. What do we say? We say, don't look at the Christians, look at Jesus. Well, where are they supposed to see him? What a tragedy we have to say, don't look at the Christians. Where else are you supposed to see Jesus but in the Christians? It should be possible, like Paul, to say, be followers of me as I am of Christ. You want to follow Jesus? You want to know what it's like? Check me out. See how I'm living. Do what I'm doing. You'll be doing what Jesus wants you to do because I'm following Christ. You can follow me safely. Very few leaders would feel comfortable saying that in the modern church. And I would feel very uncomfortable with many of them saying that. But it shouldn't be strange. It should be normative. People should be able to say, that person loves his neighbor the way Jesus loves. That person's like Jesus. Jesus said, this is how everyone will know that you're my disciples. If you love one another as I have loved you. If the character of Jesus, if the behavior of Jesus is your behavior and your character, then people know you're a disciple. Otherwise, there's no way to know. You know, we have so many times in churches, people in pulpits who the only qualification they have is that they went through some kind of a seminary or something and went through a denominational system and got qualified through the sort of the business end of things. And they end up sometimes in pulpits. And yet, I think most of us know there's been some prominent ministers, some of them have been in the news, who can preach a good sermon, but they don't live like Jesus. Right. And they're probably not even Christians by that definition. At least if they are, there's no way for us to know it, because we would know they are if they are like Jesus. Being like Jesus is what the disciples' goal is. In fact, that is in fact the great privilege of being a disciple, as we shall see. But first, before I talk about any privileges involved, I want to talk about the cost. What does it cost to be a disciple? Now, if I was going to sell Jesus like soap or like laundry detergent, I'd want to tell you how great the product was first before I let you know the price tag, especially if it's expensive. Being a disciple is expensive. I want you to hear the price tag first. But I want you to know that God's generous. And whatever the price is, it's a bargain. And when you hear the price tag, it's a very steep price. But you've got to know, if that's the price on it, the product must be amazing. It must be worth it, because God doesn't cheat anybody. If he says it costs this much to be my disciple, it must be worth that much and more. And I want to talk first of all about what it costs to be a disciple, and then I want to talk about why that's such a good thing, to why you want to be a disciple. Okay? First of all, what does it cost to be a disciple? Jesus had a lengthy passage in Luke 14 where he discussed that very issue in sufficient detail to scare off many people, which is what he intended to do. You know, Jesus wasn't as eager as we are to get people into his church, at least not on any terms other than his own. We know about the rich young ruler. That's not what this passage is about, if you're turning to Luke 14, but we know enough about the rich young ruler's story, we don't have to look it up, we can remember it. The man was eager to be saved. I mean, most preachers would, in their dreams, someone would come running up and saying, what must I do to be saved? It's hard enough to get people to even be interested in being saved that, you know, we're almost afraid to break into a conversation with them unless they bite our heads off because they don't want to hear about being saved. This man not only was begging to know, he ran to Jesus. Now in Israel, men didn't run, that was undignified. Just like when the prodigal son's father ran out to meet him. It was very undignified, but Jesus tells that story to show how God doesn't stand on ceremony, but he's so eager to see his prodigals come back, he just rushes out to meet them. This man was a ruler of the synagogue. He's called the rich young ruler. He wasn't a king. He was a synagogue ruler. He had kept the law meticulously all his life. This man was a moral man. He said he kept him from his childhood all the laws. Probably had not been perfect, but he was apparently exceptional. Now, in most churches, if a man of impeccable character, a moral man, a man of standing in society, rich, he's said to be rich. That's always desirable in a convert and a church member. In fact, some sermons in some churches are calculated to make sure none of the rich Christians want to leave because they're the most desired people when the basket is passed to have in the church. This man was rich, he was moral, he was religious. He was well respected in the community, and he was eager. This is the man you'd want to make an elder in your church. Jesus said, you go and sell what you have and give it to the poor, and then you can come follow me. The man wouldn't do it. The man left sorrowful. And you'd think, if you were Jesus, you'd think, I did that again. You know, how did I do that? This was like a prime opportunity to reel in a big fish. And I scared him off. And when the man started leaving, Jesus was sorrowful about that. But he didn't chase him. He didn't say, hey, maybe I'm being a little too rough on you here. You know, tithing is good. How about if you just tithe? We'll start with 10%. You know, you really could give more than 10%, but we'll just start with 10%, and as you become more committed, maybe you can up it to 15% a little bit. Someday maybe a little more than that. I was a little too rash in saying you need to sell all that you have and give to the poor. We can negotiate something a little more. We can ramp up on this thing. But Jesus didn't want to ramp up. He just said, this is the deal. Take it or leave it. The guy left it, and Jesus said, not worthy to be my disciple. See, here's what Jesus said in Luke 14 and verse 25. Now great multitudes went with him, and he turned and said to them. Now, this is a little bit like John 8, which we saw a moment ago, where the great number of Jews believed in him, and he turned to the people who believed in him and said, if you continue my words, you're my disciples indeed. Here he's got a big crowd of people interested in him, multitudes following him. And he turns around to thin their ranks. And Jesus did this frequently in his teaching. He said things to dissuade people from following him if they could be dissuaded. And because if you're really a disciple, you can't be dissuaded, not easily. Anyway, if you could be easily dissuaded, he wanted you dissuaded early on, not later. And he said to the great multitude, he turned to them and said to them, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and his mother, his wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, intending to build a tower, does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to finish it? Lest, after he has laid the foundation, is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, this man began to build and was not able to finish. Or what king, going to make war against another king, does not first sit down and consider whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000? Or else, while the other is still a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks conditions of peace. So likewise, whoever of you does not forsake all that he has cannot be my disciple. Now in this little section, there are 3 verses that end with the same phrase. Cannot be my disciple. If you come to me and you don't hate your father, mother, wife, children, your own life also, you cannot be my disciple. If you don't take up your cross daily, you cannot be my disciple. If you don't forsake all that you have, you cannot be my disciple. Not may not, cannot. It's not possible. It's not that I'm putting up the restriction here. I'm just telling you what it takes. It's like saying if you aren't in certain kind of condition physically, you can't climb that rock face with me because you can't do it. You have to be the kind of person who's got the kind of condition that's going to hang in there. And that condition is you're sold out from the beginning. You forsake everything. You don't care what people think of you, even your wife or your children, your husband or wife, or your father or mother. You don't even love your own life. Now, he said you have to hate them. That's a Hebrew hyperbole. He means you have to love me more than you love them. In fact, there's a parallel statement to this in Matthew 10, where he said, anyone who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves wife or children more than me is not worthy of me. Same teaching with different words. The hate word is that's a hyperbole that is commonly used in the Bible. Old and New Testament uses it often to mean simply to love someone less or to put them at a lower priority than someone else. Like when Jacob married two women, Rachel and Leah, and it says he loved Rachel more than Leah. And the next verse says, when God saw Leah was hated, he opened her womb. She wasn't hated like we think of hating somebody. She was loved less than Rachel. We were told that in the previous verse. And likewise, when God said, Jacob I have loved, Esau I have hated, he doesn't mean that God has utter disgust for Esau. It just means that he favored Jacob over Esau. And we know he did. But the point is, many times in the Hebrew idiom, if there were two persons and one was favored over the other, the one that was disfavored was hated. That's just the word that was used. Jesus said you can't serve two masters. You'll love the one and hate the other. Really? Well, yeah. You have to prefer one master's claims over the other master's claims because they can't both claim you for the same shift. So you got to favor one over the other. But you don't have to despise them. You don't have to hate them like we use the word. It's a word of lower preference. And the Jews would have understood that. You have to hate your father, mother, wife, children. Your own life also means you have to love me more than you love yourself, more than you love anyone else. My approval of you has got to have to trump anyone else's approval or disapproval in your own mind. I've got to be first, he's saying. You got to take up your cross or you can't be a disciple. What's it mean to take up a cross? Now, when we think of the cross, of course, we think of the fact that Jesus died on a cross. There'd be no frame of reference like that for his disciples at this point because he hadn't died on a cross yet. And although he probably had mentioned it to them, we know that he mentioned it to them at least 3 times before he was ever arrested, and they didn't understand what he meant. And when he was crucified, they thought it was a big surprise, frankly. But they didn't think of a cross as a Christian symbol. When Jesus said, take up your cross, they didn't go down to the Christian bookstore to buy a cross to wear around their neck. I'm carrying my cross now around my neck. This is not how it was seen. It was not a Christian symbol. It was a symbol of criminal justice. The Romans crucified many people on crosses. Jesus was not the first nor the last. There were thousands of Jews crucified. Josephus says that in the siege of Jerusalem, thousands of Jews were crucified on crosses by the Romans. It was a common means of capital punishment. And the person who was condemned in the Roman courts to be killed was led to the place of execution bearing his own cross upon his shoulder. Now you couldn't force someone to do this, by the way. If someone condemned you in court and said, you have to be crucified in such and such a location, they said, here, carry this beam, you're going to be crucified on. What if you said, make me? You can carry me if you want to, and you can nail me, but you can't make me carry anything. What are you going to do, kill me if I don't do it? You know, you couldn't make somebody carry a cross. That was a voluntary action. Once a person had been condemned and knew that they were going to die, if they were surrendered to their fate, they often cooperated. Why take a beating unnecessarily? And I'll go ahead and do it. The person who was seen carrying a cross, and no doubt the disciples had seen many people carry crosses because they were in a Roman-occupied area where zealots and rebels and criminals were crucified regularly. To see a man bearing a cross through the streets of Galilee or of Jerusalem was not an unusual thing. And when Jesus said, you need to bear your cross and come after me, they didn't think in terms of Jesus on the cross. They thought in terms of a criminal who's been condemned, trudging his way to the place of execution. Now, what's the main characteristic of that resembles being a disciple? I personally think it's this, that when a person was bearing his cross place of execution, he had given up all protests about his rights. He had adopted the mentality of a man his life is over. He's not protesting that he deserves a better trial or that somebody didn't treat him right or someone owes him money or something like that. The man, he had just accepted his fate. He's making no claim to any of his rights anymore. He's got no hopes of getting his own way anymore. It's over for him. And it sounds negative, but you have to die in order to live. Remember, Jesus said, he that seeks to save his life will lose it, but he that loses his life for my sake will find it, he said in Matthew 16. So losing your life is the way to finding it, and it sounds like a negative, bad thing. So does hating your father, mother, wife, and children. So does forsaking all you have. To our fleshly nature, that sounds like a really undesirable thing. In fact, you could hardly think of a list of more undesirable things to suggest to somebody. Do you want what I have to sell? I'll tell you what it is. You die. You give up all your rights. You alienate yourself from all people who you love who don't agree with this course you're taking. You forsake all that you have. That's what he said in verse 34. Unless you forsake all that you have, you cannot be my disciple. This is costly. This is costly. Why would anyone want to do that? Well, there are reasons, and we're going to talk about those reasons, and we're going to save those for last, but I just want you to know before we talk about, why being a disciple is a good thing, I want you to know it doesn't come cheap. The way Jesus talked in one place in Matthew 13, he talked of the kingdom of heaven being like a pearl of great price, which a man, when he found it, for the joy of it, he went and sold all that he had to obtain that pearl. An Argentine preacher named Juan Carlos Ortiz wrote a book many years ago called Disciple, and he was talking about that passage, and he said, just picture this situation, an ancient marketplace in Israel, and a man's walking through the marketplace looking at the things in the various stalls for sale, and he sees in one of these stalls this immense and perfect and gorgeous pearl, one that is clearly worth a fortune, and he's just admiring that pearl there in the stall. And the owner of it comes up to see if he's interested, and the man says, that's a beautiful pearl. And the man says, oh yes, there's nothing like it. It's the greatest pearl in the whole world. And the shopper says, well, it must be extremely expensive. And they say, oh, it is extremely expensive. You can be sure of that. The man says, well, I'm sure that I couldn't buy it. The man said, oh, you could. But I thought you said it's extremely expensive. Oh, it's extremely expensive. But you could buy it. Anyone could buy it. Well, then what in the world is the cost if everyone could buy it? What's it cost? It costs all that you have. Well, it's worth more than all that I have, so I'll take it. All that I have, that's not much. Pulls out the wallet, counts out a few bills. Here's $300. That's all I have on me. And the merchant says, well, but you have more elsewhere, don't you? Well, I have some in the bank. I have a retirement account. You can cash that in and give that to me too. What about my regular checking account? Well, that's mine too. You have to forsake all that you have. Well, okay, that pearl is definitely worth more than all the money I've got. I'll buy it. So I'll sign over all my money to you. Was that all? What do you mean is that all? Well, where do you live? Well, I live in a house, of course. We're supposed to live under a bridge. Well, the house becomes mine. You have to forsake all. Your house. What am I supposed to live in my car? Oh, you have a car, do you? 2 cars. Both mine. Well, then I guess you have everything. I'll take the pearl and go. The man says, well, wait. Do you live alone? Are you alone in this world? No, I got my wife and my 4 kids. Well, they become mine too. Oh, and one other thing. You become mine as well. And so the buyer of the pearl owns this magnificent pearl, but it's cost him everything. He says, well, you've got my money, you've got my house, my cars, my wife, my kids, me. Is there anything else I need to know? The merchant says, yeah, one other thing. He says, I've got a lot of houses and cars and servants. I need someone to live in this house for me. Take care of this woman and children for me, and drive these cars, and manage this money for me. And you're my servant. I'm going to have you assigned to that position. But although you live in the house and take care of the family and manage the money, you have to realize none of it is yours anymore. It's all mine. You're working for me now, and you and everything you have is mine. Your family's mine. You know, when my wife was killed, I had a wife earlier that was killed in an accident back in 1980. People said, are you angry at God for taking your wife from you? I thought, angry at God? She was his. He can take what he wants. He can take anything of mine. It wasn't a happy thing for me, not the least. It was a very severe loss. But it never occurred to me that God didn't have the right to take what was his. He'll take whatever he wants. It's his. If it's not, then I'm not his disciple. Unless you forsake all that you have. That doesn't mean you liquidate it all and go live under a bridge. It means you transfer title of it all.
Right.
Then you become the steward of somebody else's things and people and self. Yourself. That's how Joseph was in Egypt when he was owned by Potiphar. You might remember, he was a slave. Joseph was a slave. He didn't own himself, just like we don't own ourselves. Paul says, you're not your own. You've been bought with a price. Well, Joseph was bought with a price, and he was owned. He was not his own. He was Potiphar's property. But Potiphar entrusted him with responsibility. Joseph was honest and trustworthy, and therefore Potiphar gave him more and more responsibility. Till before long, Joseph was over the whole house. You can be sure Joseph was managing large sums of money for his master. It says his master didn't even pay attention to his own revenues. It said Potiphar didn't even know what he had except for the food that was put on his table in front of him. Everything else was in Joseph's care. Joseph probably wore very nice clothes. He probably rode in a chariot when he went places. He managed a huge household. He ate sumptuously. He slept in a comfortable bed in all likelihood. He ordered servants around. He was in charge of everything as if he was the owner, but he wasn't the owner. You see, although he had all these things, he knew that none of them were his and that he had one responsibility, and to make sure that everything he did from the day he woke up, from the moment he woke up in the morning until he went to bed at night, was to promote Potiphar's wealth, to promote Potiphar's estate, to promote Potiphar's interest, because he was owned by Potiphar. If Joseph had been given that kind of money and privilege and so forth, and had been socking away a little bit for himself for some kind of a retirement on the French Riviera or something like that, he would have been killed. He might feel like he owns a lot of money because he's managing a lot of money. It's not his, though. It'd be stealing if he acted like it was his. He's a slave. And that's what we become when we become disciples. We're servants. We are owned. We've been bought. You know, I'm not done with this passage in Luke 14, but just turn back forward a couple of pages to Luke 17, just briefly. Luke 17. Now, we don't have slaves in our culture, thank God. But almost all cultures did until about 150 years ago. There was never a culture in the whole world that didn't have slaves. And even today, there's still probably about half the world where slavery is still practiced. The kind of slavery we have in this country was very corrupt and very unjust. It involved kidnapping people and taking them against their will across the ocean from their families. This would have been punishable by death under the law of Moses. You're not allowed to kidnap. But slavery of another type was permitted, and that was when a man couldn't pay his own debts and got over his head financially. He could, and many times would, sell himself into slavery. It was a much more secure situation for some people. Some people just didn't have the ability to manage and keep their own finances above water, and so if they sold themselves into slavery, they lost all their rights, but they gained security. Sort of like what our government's trying to do for us now. It's not what we want, but it's always a trade-off. You can have liberty or security provided for you by somebody else. If they provide, to the degree they provide security, they have to take away your liberty. To the degree they provide liberty, they take away they don't provide security. I prefer liberty myself.
Amen.
I'll let God provide my security. But the point is, slaves in those days were not always oppressed. But the lot of a slave would certainly seem oppressive to us with our modern American mentality. We're absolutely opposed to the idea of anything other than personal independence. But that was, we can't take for granted that people have always felt that way. In fact, most of history, they didn't. And in the Roman Empire, more than half the population were slaves. Some were probably abused because a master had the power to abuse a slave, but not all of them were abused. Some of them were treated like family members. The law of Moses said that after a slave has been serving for 7 years, the master has to give him his freedom. But if the slave says, I don't want my freedom, I love my master, I like it here, I want to be a slave for life, then he could be. We can hardly imagine anyone wanting that. Although, actually in our country, when the Emancipation Declaration was made, there were some, probably not most, but some slaves actually were in good, they were part of the family, of the household they're in. They weren't that eager to go. Slavery is not always oppressive, although unfortunately it often is. And in biblical times, it sometimes was not. But it was always a situation where the slave had to do what he was told. And that seems oppressive to us, because that's just not the American way. But Jesus is talking to his disciples using the illustration of slaves whom they knew. They were not themselves, in a slavery situation in society, but they knew of many who were. And he gives this example. In Luke 17:7, he says, which of you having a servant, the word is slave in the Greek, plowing or tending sheep, will say to him when he comes in from the field, come at once and sit down and eat? But will he not rather say to him, prepare something for my supper, and gird yourself and serve me until I have eaten and drunk, and afterward you will eat and drink? So here's a slave. He's been out working in the heat of the day, tending sheep and farming all day long. He comes in hot and sweaty and tired at the end of the day. And if it were you or me, or if it was your husband, he'd want to sit down and say, bring me food. And Jesus said, well, that slave doesn't expect that. He comes in from a hard day's work, and his master says, now fix my food. And when I've eaten and drunk, you can give yourself a little something. Jesus is not saying that's how slaves should be treated. He's saying that's how slaves are treated, and that's what slaves expect. They expect nothing different. That's the lot of a slave. But then he says this. Does he thank that servant because he did the things that were commanded him? I think not. So likewise, you, when you have done all those things which you are commanded, say, we are unprofitable servant slaves. We have done only what is our duty to do. Now, this teaching of Jesus is not a teaching about how people should treat slaves. It's a teaching about how people should think about themselves when they are Christians. Did I turn that off?
You might.
I might have. Did I mute that? Oh, the battery's dead.
Battery's dead. Well, we'll take care of you.
The battery's showing you.
Alan, here's mine.
This will do. Thank you. Is it on? Testing. How do I turn it on? Or is it? You got to slide it?
Got it.
Okay. So, what Jesus is saying is, what you know to be true of slaves in a household is what you should know to be true about you in God's household. That all day long, you belong to Him. Now you might say, well, that sounds like a drudgery. Well, if you don't love your master, it is a drudgery, to tell you the truth. There's hardly any life I could consider more horrible than being religious and not loving God.
Yeah.
Man. If I didn't love God, I would not want to be religious. It sounds horrible. But if you love God, one thing you'll find if you ever love somebody, and many of you already do, but if you're too young to have ever done so, you'll find this out to be true. If you ever really love somebody, nothing gives you so much pleasure as giving them pleasure. That's what love almost is defined by. Because love is when you put somebody else ahead of yourself and loving it. Like not because someone makes you, not because there's a gun to your head, but because there's something in you that just naturally puts that person ahead of yourself because it makes you feel good to do that. You love to impoverish yourself if that's going to make them happy. Now you say, I can't imagine that, then you don't know what love is. That's what love is. If you love God, then this is no drudgery. It's like in Hannah Whitehall Smith's book, The Christian Secret of a Happy Life, she gave the example of a woman who is a maid who came in and worked for a bachelor with kids, a widower, and she cleaned up all the messes, and she cooked the meals, she watched the kids, and she got paid and went home. It was a drudgery to her. But then after a time, she and the man fell in love, and they got married, and had a wonderful relationship. And she still cleaned up the messes and watched the kids and cooked the meals, but it was a different life. She did it gladly. To her, it was the fulfillment of a dream. It's the same work, but a totally different life. Because once she was doing it for pay, and now she's doing it out of love. You're not a disciple if you don't love God. Now you might say, I don't know if I feel like I love God. Well, that can be worked on. I'm not talking about feeling. The first evidence that you love is that you want to please somebody. Not so that they'll please you back, but just because you just want them to be pleased. Because you love them. You want them to be happy more than you want you to be happy. That's what love feels like. That's what love is. Sometimes there's that romantic element, sometimes there's not. Love isn't always romantic. The love you have for your children, that's not romantic, but it's that kind of love. Pleasing them makes you happy. When you have to discipline them, it makes you unhappy. You don't like to displease them. You do because they need it, but you want their good more than your own. When you love God, that's how it is with God. To serve God is not a drudgery. It says in 1 John chapter 5 and verse 1 that this is the love of God, that we keep His commandments, and His commandments are not burdensome. They are not grievous, the King James says. It's not a burden to obey God when you love God. This is what the love of God is. You do what He wants, and it's not a burden to you. If anything, any other life would be a burden to you. I heard of a woman who left the Lord after many years of following God, and she told her children she felt like she'd come out of a dark cave. She was now out in the bar scene. She was out doing the worldly hedonistic thing now. She felt like she just said, I've come out of a cave into the light. When I heard that, I thought, I don't think she ever knew God. To me, going out where she is now, that'd be me going into the cave. I'd feel dark and damp and lonely there. I feel like I'm in the light with God. Serving God is joyful. I can't imagine wanting to do something else. I mean, I'm not so spiritual. I'm not a really good person. But loving God just makes you want to enjoy His company forever. And in the right relationship with Him, which isn't just pals. We're not just pals with Jesus. We're His friends if we do what He commands. And we will do so out of love if we are true disciples. Back to Luke 14, where we were. Jesus gives two examples about counting the cost. One is, He says, if someone wants to build a tower, or we might say a building, a skyscraper or something today, a contractor wants to build a spec building of some kind to sell and make money on, he first has to see if his line of credit is adequate. Jesus said he sits down first to see if he has the wherewithal to finish the project. He says otherwise, what could happen, and has often happened, if you go to Las Vegas, you'll see a lot of this, you'll get a tower half built and no more money to finish it. I know about Las Vegas because I speak in Las Vegas quite a bit. And it's interesting how many half-built hotels and half-built casinos and half-built towers there are there, because they just ran out of money. The place was hit hard, and a lot of buildings are part-built. It looks ridiculous. It looks tragic. Jesus said if you do that and your building gets half-built and you don't have enough to finish it, everyone will mock you and say he began but he couldn't finish. But Jesus is saying don't even start being a disciple if you're not going to pay the price. If you're not going to pay all that it takes to finish it, stay home. This is not for wimps. This is not for the half-hearted. This is worth more than that. It's worth more than anything else you could spend your life on. You insult God by offering less for that. The thing is, there are many people who have allegedly started following Jesus, and they give up their ways of sin, and their old sinful friends say, well, he'll be back. And he says to his friends, oh, you guys are worldly, you smoke it, and you drink, and you do worldly things, and I don't do that anymore, I'm following Jesus. And the friends say, yeah, he'll be back. The best thing in the world that can happen to those friends is find out he isn't back. But sometimes he is. Sometimes they feel vindicated. And when he comes back, because he wasn't willing to pay the price, like that seed planted on shallow ground that didn't have root, and because of tribulation and persecution, because of the word, he comes, falls away, goes back. What he is saying is, I tried Jesus, there wasn't anything there. It brings reproach on him and on Christ. So Jesus said, don't do that to me. Don't even come. Don't even try to be a disciple if you're not willing to pay the full price. That's why I'm telling you what the full price is up front. He says it's like a king who's got 10,000 soldiers. He's being attacked by a king who's got 20,000. What you going to do? You're outnumbered 2-1. You're the king with the 10,000. Your enemy's got the 20,000. What are you going to do? He says you do one or two of two things. You sit down and figure out if your 10,000 can beat the 20,000. Now, at first glance, it might seem like, well, there's no way that could happen. But that's not necessarily true. Gideon with 300 beat 30,000 Midianites. If you've got a fully committed army of 10,000 and your enemy's got 20,000 troops, and they're UN troops, you got a good chance. You don't know from the numbers, it's the quality that will tell you where the victory's like. So the king with 10,000 says, can we beat him? Can we beat this guy? And she said, if the answer is no, what do? He says, you send out an embassage to make peace with the enemy. Well, that sounds nice. Peacemaking's good. Or is it? Depends on who the enemy is and what the terms of peace are that he's going to require. You see, when a guy who's got 20,000 soldiers comes against you and he knows you only got 10,000, he's got something he wants. He wants to rule you. He wants to conquer you. He wants you to be his servant now. And that's what his troops are there for. Send out, and you send out ambassadors, let's make some peace. Okay, just surrender. That's the conditions of peace. Otherwise, my 20,000 are going to overrun your 10,000. You've got to defeat them. You've got to resist them. When you become a disciple, you are outnumbered. The world, there's more out there of unbelievers than there are believers. However, there's more resources on our side than there are on their side. Those resources are not visible always, but if you have faith, you count on those resources, and you know it can be done. You can stand in the minority. Daniel did. Daniel's the only Christian he knew, except for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, not Christian, but of course a godly man, in Babylon, a pagan area. But he determined in his heart, and he's going to resist the cultural pressure. And he did resist valiantly. And that's the decision a person has to make if they're to be a disciple. Will I stand alone against the culture, against my friendship group, against my family if need be? Will I forsake all that I have if necessary? I mean, it is necessary. I have to sign everything over to God, but what if he tells me to actually sell it like he told the rich young ruler? Well, then I got to do it, and not whine. I'm not in this for me. That's the one thing that Jesus makes clear about this. You're not in this for you. If you're in it for you, there's a lot of things you can do that'll be better for you in the short run. So why would anyone ever want to be a disciple? That's a great question, and that's what I want to answer. There are reasons to be a disciple. There's reasons to pay that price. They aren't reasons that will appeal to everybody. But there are people that God's Spirit has touched their hearts, and these reasons will ring a bell with them. Will just resonate. With other people, they say, I don't want that. It's like back in the Jesus when a bunch of hippies got saved, and their friends said, well, what do you do for fun now? You don't smoke dope anymore? You don't go to parties anymore? What do you do for fun? And they would say, well, we go to Bible studies and prayer meetings and stuff like that. That didn't sound fun at all to their friends. Because it isn't for everybody. It is for some. People ask me, do you ever get a vacation? Not on purpose. You ever going to retire? Whatever for. What would I do then? Why would I retire from ministry? This is not something I do for money. This is not something I do because I have to. This is something, following Jesus, this is what God has called me to do. He calls you to do something else, but following Jesus is what you do for life. It's your new life. It's your new identity. You follow Jesus. There's nothing to go back to unless you left a hedge there, left an out for yourself when you came in. And what Jesus said, don't. You got to go all in. You got to be all in or you're not in. And I want to tell you how much it costs because I don't want you figuring that out later and say, oh, I didn't sign up for that. You need to know you did. Now why would anyone want to do that stuff? Well, one is you can be with him. Jesus called his disciples to be with him. The multitudes like to come out once in a while and hear him preach. They were curious. They go home and go back to their own lives. The disciples were those who left what they're doing and they stayed with him. They wanted to be with him all the time. A disciple can be with Jesus all the time, and that's worth something to a disciple. Not everyone appreciates that. Not everyone values that. But if you do, being a disciple is the way to be there. There's another thing, too, not just being with him, but being taught by him. In Matthew 11, and I know I knew this verse from Sunday school when I was a kid, I'm sure you know it too. Matthew 11:28 through 30, Jesus said, "Come unto me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." But then he said, "Take my yoke on you and learn from me. For I am meek and gentle of heart, and you will find rest to your souls." Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. This is the yoke of discipleship. When it's a figure of speech. We don't have yokes here anymore if we don't use oxen for plowing. I don't know if anyone here ever saw a yoke, probably in a museum. But a yoke was a bar of wood that went over the head of an ox, or more likely two oxen, and it was a steering device. The farmer would use it to steer the oxen to pull the plow where he wanted to go, or the cart, or whatever they were pulling. A yoke brought an ox or two oxen into subjection to be steered by their owner. Once the yoke was on, you lost your freedom. And Jesus said, "You take my yoke on you." Now, all the rabbis use that terminology in Israel. If you signed on to be a disciple of any given rabbi, you were taking his yoke on you. That's the way they spoke about it. You know, Jesus was a carpenter growing up, and Justin Martyr, one of the early church fathers, said that he had a shingle out in front of his carpenter shop when he was a young man. Apparently all the tradesmen did. They had some kind of slogan, just like, just do it, or have it your way, or, the different slogans different companies have now. The tradesmen had slogans. And according to Justin Martyr, who lived in the 2nd century and may have had information that was accurate, we don't know, he said Jesus had a shingle out in front of his carpenter shop because he specialized in ox yokes. That was his specialty. And his shingle said, "My yokes fit well." Now, Jesus said, "My yoke is easy." And I don't know if Jesus really had that shingle in front of his shop, but it's seriously given as if it's a fact of history. But whether he did or not, I would say his yoke fits well. It's not such an uncomfortable yoke because it's what you were made for. It wasn't made for you. That would make it fit well. You were made for it.
Wow.
That makes it fit well better.
Yeah.
You were made to be a disciple of Jesus. Anything you do less than that is not going to fit well. And you have to die to yourself, because what you have to die to is what doesn't really fit. It's not what you're made for. Living to please yourself, living to please other people, living to make a lot of money and just keep it and do what you want. That may seem like what you want to do, but that's not what you're made for. And that's why people who actually do those things often end up committing suicide, or getting, they're addicted to drugs or alcohol to try to numb themselves because they're not happy. They're doing what they're not made for. I'm not saying there's no rich people who are happy. I'm sure there are. But many, many people find that that life isn't what fits well. What really fits is what you're made for, and that's to be a follower of Jesus Christ. Jesus said, "Take my yoke on you and learn from me." That is, you become my disciple, I'll become your teacher directly. People have often said to me, "Is there some Bible course or commentary, is there something you can recommend? Because I'd like to know the Bible like you do." I said, "Well, I didn't learn from a Bible course. I've never been to school. I have a high school education, nothing more than that. I've never been to seminary. I've read some commentaries, I guess, but many of them, I don't know which ones I'd recommend without reservation. But I will say this, the only thing I know is that I began to study at the feet of Jesus when I was a young man. And it's been delightful. He's my teacher. It says in 1 John 2:27, "You have no need that anyone teach you, but that anointing you received from him, the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of Christ in you, teaches you of all things." It says in Mark chapter 4 and verse 34, that when Jesus spoke to the multitudes, he never spoke to them except with parables, which was his message veiled in a story. The crowds didn't understand it. But it says in Mark 4:34, "But when he was alone, he expounded all things privately to his disciples." When the disciples said, "Why do you speak to the crowds in parables?" He said, "Because it's given to you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, not them. You're a disciple. I don't cast my pearls before swine. I'm on a secret mission to bring the kingdom of God in, to conquer the kingdom of darkness. I'm not going to give away my strategies to the enemy. You have to be fully in before I let you know all my secrets." In Psalm 27 it says, "The secret of the Lord is with them that fear him." God shares his secrets. Jesus said to his disciples, "I don't call you servants but friends, because a servant doesn't know What does Master mean? But I've told you everything. You see, to be a disciple means that you have taken that step that puts you into Christ's confidence. He becomes your teacher. He'll teach you from the Scripture. At least almost everything I've learned from him I got from Scripture. But the point is, it's a world of difference than just learning from books, learning from other teachers or whatever. You can learn from other teachers and books, and I have too, but not half so much as I feel like I've just learned from being with Jesus and him teaching me from his word as I meditate on it and read it and so forth. That's the joy of being a true disciple, is that you have him as your teacher. But more than that, he said, you'll be my disciples and you'll know the truth, and truth will make you free. From what? Being a slave of sin. That's what he went on to talk about. Being free from the slavery of sin. One of the great frustrations of religious people who aren't disciples is that they know they should do better, but they live in sin. And because they aren't comfortable in the world because they're religious, and they're not comfortable in religion because they're sinners, it's the most miserable of all lives, is being a religious person. But being a Jesus freak is a very wonderful life, because you become a disciple and you become free from bondage of sin. That doesn't mean you never sin, but it means you live successfully. You're given a power from on high that is given to the disciples to live the life of Jesus, because Jesus' Spirit comes in you and lives his life in you. It's a supernatural thing. And if you don't know it, then I can't explain it. If you become a disciple, I don't have to explain it. You'll know it. Because you'll know the truth, and the truth will make you free. And being free is what I like. That's why I prefer the government to give me freedom and let me worry about the security side. No, you can keep the security at the airports. I'd like to just walk onto a plane, and if there's a bomb on the plane, I'll leave that between God and me and the rest of us. I don't want to be strip searched every time I get on a plane. I get on planes very frequently. And I just wonder how much radiation is. I'm surprised I don't glow in the dark. I just soon have no security provided by the government, at least minimal. How about just minimal security? And let me have freedom. And Jesus says, you want to be free? Be my disciple. Continue in my words, you'll be my disciple, you'll know the truth, and the truth will make you free. And only you will be free. He goes on, a few verses later, says, if the Son makes you free, you're free indeed. I'm a free man. I'm not in bondage to rules and regulations. I follow Jesus. I love God. If you love him, you keep his commandments. There's no bondage there. That's freedom. That means I can live by the way I know I should and want to live. If I was just religious, I would know how I should and want to live, but I couldn't do it because I wouldn't be free. I have to be a disciple to be free. I have to be following, committed, totally. Okay. There's more to say than that, but there's a couple of things I want to say. I've run longer than I should have probably, but I want to make two more points, and these are very important points. Look at Matthew chapter 8, if you would. Not all points take equally long to make. In fact, you probably don't have any idea how many points I think I've made. How many points on my outline I've covered. I'm not sure myself. In Matthew chapter 8, look at verses 1 and 2. When he had come down from the mountain, great multitudes followed him, and behold, a leper came and worshipped him, saying, that's not the one I thought it was. Could be. Oh, I'm sorry, it's Mark 8. Couldn't read my own handwriting. Yes, I do use notes. All right, Mark 8. Now, this will be right. Verse 1, in those days, the multitude being very great and having nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him. Now there's a multitude, and then there's his disciples, two different groups. And he said to them, I have compassion on the multitude because they have now continued with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. So you know the story. They got a boy's lunch, a few fish, a few pieces of bread. He multiplied the loaves, and it says in verse 6, so he commanded the multitude to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves and gave thanks and broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before them, and to set them before the multitude. Jesus didn't walk around and hand bread to all the people in the multitude. He gave the bread to his disciples and said, you feed them. You give the bread to them. Being a disciple puts you in the position to be of service to the world, to carry out the manifestation of Christ's compassion to the world. He says, I have compassion on these people. You give them food. I'll hand it to you. You give it to them. He delegates the ministry of salvation to the world to his disciples to carry to the world. There are people in ministry who probably aren't disciples, and they shouldn't be. But Jesus has chosen that his disciples will help the world, will serve the world. Again, not everyone will find that interesting. Serve? I'd rather be served. Well, then you're probably a candidate for being a disciple at this point.
Right.
But when you grow up, and you'd like your life to count for something, and you'd like, when you die, to feel like you left the world a better place than when you arrived, that does, I realize, require a certain maturity level. Some people used to reach that level at age 16. Now I think it's more like 36, but
Yeah.
nonetheless, eventually you get there. Eventually you get there. No insult intended. I'm sure some of you kids are way above the curve for society. But when it matters to you to have your life count in the world for God, then you need to be a disciple of Jesus, because those are the ones he gives the bread to and says, now you go out and give it to those people. To serve God, to serve the world, to serve the multitudes for Christ, because he has compassion on them and something has to be done for them. You don't have what it takes to serve the world. The disciples didn't have anything but 2 loaves and 5 fishes, or was it the other way around? 5 loaves and 2 fishes. But Jesus provides the miracle. Jesus provides the power. Jesus provides the resources, but he hands it to the disciples, and they become the agents of mercy and compassion to the world to feed the dying, starving world. These people weren't actually dying, but they were hungry after 3 days. And so, being a disciple puts you in a position to have responsibility delegated to you, to serve. Now, I saved for last this point, this reason for being a disciple. This is the most important of all. And it only will appeal to a certain kind of person. The purpose of discipleship, the most important purpose of discipleship, is that what Jesus said in John chapter 15 and verse 8. He said, by this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, so you will be my disciples. So you will be my disciples. What? If you bear much fruit. And why do that? Because in that my Father is glorified. You see, this is the most important thing that we under represent in our preaching. The purpose of the gospel is that God is glorified.
Right.
Not that we get out of hell free, not that we have a better life now, not that we have joy, peace, and love, and good vibes. All that is true, all that happens. There are fringe benefits for being involved here, but the motive for being a Christian is to glorify God. He says, in this my Father is glorified. That, if you don't care about that, go somewhere else, because glorifying God is what the universe was made for.
Right.
And if you're not in line with that, you're not in touch with the universe. You're not in touch with reality. You're not in touch with even who you are or what you're made for. God made you and everything else for one purpose, to glorify himself. And some says that makes God seem very egocentric. Well, I don't know of anyone who has a better right to be egocentric, but I don't think he is egocentric. I believe that God knows where the pieces go in the puzzle. He made something that was made to be in sync with him, in proper relation to him. And since he is far more wonderful and magnificent than any of us have imagined, there's no way anything in his creation could be in sync with him if not honoring and respecting him. You see, if you don't honor and respect God, you're simply out of touch with reality. You think something else is impressive. You think Justin Bieber's impressive. That's okay. I have my favorites, too. It's just not on my list, but you think something's impressive. Your boyfriend, your girlfriend, the rock star, the Cubs, you know.
Let's go easy now.
You know what idolatry is.
You don't have to hand them any rocks, you know.
No, the truth of the matter is, if you're not sufficiently impressed with God, you'll be inappropriately impressed with something else that isn't really that impressive.
Right.
You'll just not be in touch with reality. And if you're unimpressed with God, you're blind and stupid.
Right.
I don't mean that in a not insulting way. Not really. It is insulting. But I honestly can't really think of any other way to put it, to say it correctly. God is amazing. And there's just not a word we can use. We used to say awesome, but then awesome became a really term dragged down into the dirt. Everything's awesome now. It used to be only God was awesome in the Grand Canyon. And now everything's awesome, you know. The new hubcaps you got are awesome now. But the truth is, we don't really have the words to describe how magnificent God is. And once we realize it, we realize that glorifying God is the only thing that makes any sense. And it makes sense that we were made to be part of the whole creation glorifying God. And until you want to do that, you're not going to really enjoy being a disciple at all. It's just not going to appeal to you at all. It's going to rub you the wrong way. Because you're still putting something else in God's place. You're glorifying something else. It might be yourself. It might be some idol you have out there. But when you're ready to put God in His proper place, then you find that everything comes into sync. Because that's how it was made to be. And until He's there at the center, you're out of orbit. Now, Jesus said, "My Father is glorified by you bear much fruit," and that's how you are being a disciple. If you're a disciple, you bear much fruit, and God is glorified. That's the end motivation. Everything has to be for that motivation. God should be glorified. Everything. Remember, I've quoted a couple of times 1 Corinthians 6:20, where Paul said, "You're not your own, you've been bought with a price. Therefore, glorify God in your body and your spirit, which are God's." Therefore, since you've been bought, what are you supposed to do? Glorify God. That's what life is for. It's for the glory of God. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 30, "Whatever you do, whether you eat or drink, do all to the glory of God." Now that eat or drink thing really brings it down to the mundane level. I thought that when I go to church and sing songs, I should glorify God. Well, if you get to that point, you'll be doing better than you're probably doing now. Because half the time when we're singing songs, we're thinking about something else, not what we're singing. I don't know about you. Probably no one in this room does that kind of part, but a lot of people do out there. And, you know, they sing the songs. That's when they lift their hands, and that's when they're supposedly glorifying God. A lot of times they're really thinking about, you know, the game after church service, or what you're going to cook, or what you're going to have, or who you're going to meet. And, you know, God's kind of sort of somewhere in there. Something else is in the middle. But you see, it's not even good enough. If you get to the place where you come to church, you fully glorify God with all your heart. That's not everything. That's just your religious worship service. What else? What you eat or drink? How you spend your money? How do you talk to your family? How do you conduct yourself in business? Do you do everything for the glory of God? If not, then you have something to learn about being a disciple. Yeah. And that is that Jesus and His glory, His concerns become the center of your life. Nothing else really matters. You know, in Matthew 5:16, Jesus said, "Let your light shine before men, so that men may see your good works and do what? Glorify your Father." The problem with the Pharisees is they wanted people to see their good works and glorify them. But Jesus said, no, people need to see your good works, but you need to do your good works in such a way that doesn't bring glory to you. They need to glorify your Father. And it's interesting to me when John is telling us about the last conversation that he records between Jesus and Peter in John chapter 21. He actually talks to Peter about how Peter's going to die. But in John 21:19, the way John tells it, he says, let me read it in John's words. He's talking about the death of Peter that was going to come much later. But in chapter 21 of John, in verse 19, it says, this he spoke, signifying by what death Peter would glorify God. That's interesting. He could have just said, by what death Peter would die. That'd be the normal way of talking. But he's saying, Jesus indicated by what kind of death Peter would glorify God. It was a given that, of course, Peter's going to have to glorify God in his death, but what way? By what death will you glorify God? Who was I talking to? Who was telling me that their father or their grandfather died singing and clapping? We were talking to someone just recently. I don't remember who it was now. It was just a few days ago. Somebody was talking about how when their father, I think it was their father, died, he was singing hymns and clapping and smiling and so forth. And someone else who wasn't a Christian there said, well, that's the way to die. And they came to the Lord too. Many times when people died as Christians ought to die, it led people to Christ. It glorifies God. In fact, I think it was John Wesley who used to say, our people die well. It used to be, before everyone died under anesthesia, that Christians died differently than non-Christians. Nowadays, most people die drugged up, and you can't tell the difference between one and another because their personalities are not even there. But it used to be that Christians died singing and smiling and praising, and non-Christians died screaming and, wailing. I have a book at home called Voices from the Edge of Eternity. Maybe you have that book. It's like the last dying words of lots of people, Christian and non-Christian. And what a difference there is. But, you see, Christians must live and die for the glory of God. Now, let me tell you young people something you may not know. You are going to die. I realize that people don't know that sometimes, or they act like they don't know that. And then when someone dies, they're all surprised. Whoa, someone died. Again, when people say, are you mad at God because your wife was killed when she was 25 years old? I knew she was going to die. There was no surprise. I didn't know she died at age 25. I would have hoped it might have been maybe more like age 85 or older, but I knew, when I married her, I knew she was going to die. And I knew that when she was going to die is God's decision, not mine. I actually knew that I was going to die too. It hasn't happened yet, but I know it's going to happen. And therefore, I want to live in such a way that I glorify God in my death. But I'm not likely to glorify Him in my death unless I've glorified Him in my life.
Right.
The best funerals I've ever been at are the ones where people who knew the person get up and they say, that person was the most Christ-like person I ever saw. And they tell stories about the way that person glorified God in their life. You can glorify God in your death even if no one ever sees you die, because of the way you lived. Once you're dead, they'll be reflecting on that more than they did when you were alive. That's sometimes the most potent time to have to be a witness, is when you're dead in the coffin and your friends have all gathered and people are remembering what you lived like if you were a disciple. Glorifying God is the only motive that makes any sense at all. And one of the reasons that I was saying last night, have problems with our converts not being real Christians, not taking Lordship seriously, is because people naturally want to glorify themselves or seek their own honor. And sometimes we preach the gospel as if it's a way of doing that for yourself. You can get some recognition, you get some respect, you can get some, you have eternal glory for yourself. You're going to go off to glory. You're going to have a mansion there. You're going to reign with Christ. Well, those things are true, but if that's why people are getting saved, so they can seek more glory and honor for themselves, even stretch it out forever, it's not the right motive. It's when we simply reflect the glory of God that the world will see the light and the glory coming from us, like the moon. The moon doesn't have any light. It's just a gray rock. But when the world goes dark because the sun's gone over the horizon and the world can't see the sun anymore, they can see the moon because the moon is up in the heavenly places with the sun and it reflects the sun's light back to the earth. Because the moon is looking at the glory of the sun's glory is reflected back to the earth, so there's light on the world. Jesus said to his disciples, as long as I'm in the world, I'm the light of the world, but you're going to be the light of the world. You are the light of the world. And that light is the glory of God. What is God like? That's what the world needs to know. They need to find out by seeing you. And when they do, they need to see it in a way that they glorify your Father in heaven, Jesus said. Now, discipleship is how that's done. That's why we do discipleship. That's why we become disciples of Jesus. So God will be glorified. We also have the advantages of being with Jesus, which anyone who has come to know him knows you wouldn't trade that for anything. In fact, you will trade everything else for that, if you need to. And being taught by him, and being used by him to reach the world. But mostly to just please and glorify God, and to be in the right relationship with him. That's the reason for being a disciple. Now, we're going to have one more session this afternoon. I don't know if we'll go this long. We're done this one. But we're going to talk about following Jesus, what it means to follow Jesus. I've given you kind of reasons for it and told you how much it may cost you. But how is it done? What does it mean to follow Jesus? Like I said at the beginning of this talk, when Jesus said to Matthew, follow me, it was easy to know what to do. He's going that way, I'll go that way. Right behind him. That's what following someone meant. Like a stalker. But how do you stalk Jesus now? How do you follow Jesus now? Well, there is a way, and it is taught in Scripture. We'll talk about that. But right now, let's pray. And Father, I ask you to help each of us to receive from your Holy Spirit the proper impressions, proper convictions, proper insight into this matter of being a disciple of Jesus, and especially in terms of valuing it as it ought to be valued, like a pearl of great price that we would gladly forsake every other option in order to obtain. I wish, Father, for these young people especially, who have most of their lives ahead of them, I presume, to know this, as you were very gracious to let me know when I was 16 years old, what it meant to be a disciple, and to call me and to give me this wonderful life that you've given me in being able to follow you and know you, and how, what an advantage that is, overcoming to that knowledge at a later age and realizing how much time has been wasted and lost. I pray for the older ones here too, Father, there may be some who have not understood previously what it means to be a disciple, who thought that being a Christian just means being essentially in church and being agreeable. I pray, Father, that you'll give us each the revelation in our hearts by your Spirit of what our true state may be and what the next step is that you have for each of us to take, as there is always another step. As long as we breathe, we want to take another step and have that be a step that is following Jesus. And we ask this in Jesus' name.